On July 1st, 1798, Napoleon led his forces into Egypt in order to take the ancient lands. With him, Napoleon did not only take his troops, but also a bunch of mathematicians, artisans, scientists, including botanists and zoologists, in order to study the vast landscape. With this, a new obsession with Egypt would start to emerge. Years later, this obsession would finally get a name: Egyptomania. A lot has been spoken about Egyptomania, as well as its various effects on culture and society, depending on the era and decade of the obsession. In the different parts of this video series, I'd like to answer and clarify a few things about Egyptomania, as well as how each era of obsession affected and changed and added a new layer to the obsession as well as the mythos surrounding Egypt in society of the time of obsession. In the different parts of this video series, I'd like to answer and clarify a few things about Egyptomania, as well as how each era of obsession affected and changed and added a new layer to the obsession as well as the mythos surrounding Egypt in society of the time of obsession. I would also like to get into the lore of Egyptomania around mummies and how mummies might have played a role in making Egyptomania more abundant in mainstream society.
Death. Eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket.
I would also like to get into the lore of Egyptomania around mummies and how mummies might have played a role in making Egyptomania more abundant in mainstream society. Although Egyptomania has its roots in the late 18th century, there have been little spouts of interest in Egyptian culture long before. In the 11th and 12th centuries, often or not, nobles and aristocrats alike had what was considered to be cabinets of curiosity. Often in these cabinets of curiosity were mummified remains such as feet, hands, fingers, and sometimes even mummified heads. Along with mummies being in the cabinet of curiosities, there was also regular use of mummy powder, which was a substance that believed to have special properties. The Arabic word for this powder was mumia, which eventually morphed into the common word mummy. This interest in Egypt even goes further back as we look at similarities in architecture as well as similarities in sculpture techniques and style. In the 2nd millennia BC, there was much influence from Egypt in Greek architecture, as well as Greek sculptures and designs of these sculptures, as well as the bodily form. Missionaries who journeyed to Greece from the Tigris and Euphrates Valley would see these sculptures and take the knowledge of their techniques as well as their body forms back to their home countries, and would later inspire Hindu depictions of the human form in their artwork as well. There was even a story that went around after Alexander the Great's death that claimed that his mother was impregnated by the Egyptian god Ahmed. When Rome started to conquest Egypt around 30 BCE, they not only looted many tombs and plundered much of Egyptian treasures, but they also took many obelisks back to Rome and put them on display to symbolize their conquesting over an ancient empire of the past and show that they were the new large empire of the future. So even before Egyptomania started to make its appearance in the late 18th century, we can see that there was always this obsession with Egypt as well as an influence on other parts of the world. Originally, Napoleon was not meant to invade Egypt. In fact, his superiors, or the committee who was in charge of France at the time, wanted him to invade England. However, Napoleon wanted to conquer Egypt because he thought it'd be far more beneficial for France to have a colony there. It would also disrupt English shipping because instead of going through the Strait of Gibraltar like they would ordinarily they would have to instead go all the way around the tip of Africa, making their trip even longer. Napoleon did not only take his 35,000 men, but also took 151 artists, mathematicians, scientists, geometrists, and experts in the field of studying ancient structures. Probably some of the most important people he took with him on the journey were printers, who knew how to work the newest technology, the printing press. With a 130-ship fleet, they sailed to the harbor of Abu Kira in 1768. For over 6 months, Napoleon and his forces fought the Mamelukes and other groups of Arabs who were either separate or alliance with the Ottoman Empire, who were the occupiers and rulers of Egypt at the time. With the amount of force that Napoleon had, along with his cannons, he was almost victorious at every battle. There was even supposedly a battle outside or on the Giza Plateau where the Great Pyramids stand. However, most likely this is an over-dramatization of what actually occurred, and maybe they weren't even close to the ancient pyramids of Egypt, rather being near them as a backdrop. As Napoleon's forces started to rack up victories, the savants, noticing their surroundings, started to take sketches and measurements of the ancient structures of Egypt that laid around them. Napoleon's forces would not be victorious in Egypt for long because the British Navy, having figured out where their ships had been stationed, launched a bombardment, sinking many of the ships that lay in the harbor where they were anchored. England would eventually launch a counter-invasion to Napoleon's forces and start to push them out of Egypt. In fact, the only reason Napoleon left Egypt was because he needed to sustain his forces in France, and left the majority of his forces behind along with the rest of the savants. In 1809, English forces finally obtained major victories against Napoleon's remaining forces in Egypt, and the whole situation eventually devolved. The savants, having collected tons of specimens, fossils, and rubbings of the ancient Egyptian walls, eventually returned home themselves. They negotiated with the British and the Ottoman Empire to hold on to a majority of their collection. Out of this invasion of Egypt, 2 major books would be published. The first book would be published by Anon, who became Baron Anon. It was known as The Voyage to Egypt and is quickly published and printed worldwide. The second was by the savants, who printed their descriptions of Egypt in 10 volumes, which was called the Description des Alzite. However, France was not the only country that collected tons of specimens and samples of Egyptian architecture and work. From the negotiations with England, the English were able to get the Rosetta Stone, which was found by the savants. The Ottomans, who were extremely grateful to the English for intervening on their behalf, awarded them with a whole obelisk. This obelisk, once partially buried on its side, was actually dug up by the English forces in their spare time by Mr. Reed. However, the obelisk was so massive it could not be moved easily, and would not be moved until 1973. By the time the English had finally successfully moved the massive monolith, which got the name the Needle of Cleopatra, to its new location, Berth Royal Victoria Park, much of upper English society, as well as upper society in general, started to celebrate ancient antiquity of Egypt. It also became a symbol of national pride and victory over the French, as they would also print Egyptian hieroglyphs on teacups and teapots. However, extremely popular for the elites, Egyptomania did not have much for the common man, except for the use of mummies in everyday materials, such as paint and even being used as print paper. In fact, interestingly enough, by 1875, mummies became a thriving business, as many Arabs in the region would actually dig up mummies from ancient crypts, as well as create new mummies by having bodies dry out in the desert. Elites, on occasion, would buy a mummy and have a wrap party where the mummy would gradually be unwrapped for a large audience. Mummies were even being used as fuel sources for heating. There was also interesting literature at the time where the mummy started to become a character in fiction. However, these early prototype for the traditional mummy that we would see today were not these lumbering monsters, but were really aristocratic princes of the past who often were reanimated and brought back to life rather than through spiritual supernatural means. 1845's Words of a Mummy by Edgar Allan Poe essentially had a mummy coming back to life and just commenting about how times had changed. There was also an interesting story called The Mummy's Foot, where a disembodied mummified foot came back to life to haunt its owner. With the help of the new invention of the printing press, as well as distribution of various prints, the new information being gathered by Egyptian researchers would capture the imaginations of the entire world, thus launching one of the earliest forms of Egyptomania, as well as starting the new field of Egyptology. Although the stories and use of mummies in everyday ointments and paints is interesting, mummies, along with Egyptomania, would not be for the everyman until the discovery of wonderful things. Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned for part 2 when it comes out, and like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.